Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's session on developments in digital trade and sustainability. I will be chairing the session and also moderate the Q&A. Before we start, I would like to ask the audience to mute the microphone. Please also feel free to post your questions and comments via the Zoom chat function. And as you may notice, in the recent years, digital trade has grown exponentially and has helped many small and medium-sized firms to overcome challenge of scale and distance to enter global market. In the meantime, the transition towards sustainable development will integrate environmental health, social equity, and economic vitality, so which will be crucial for building an inclusive, dynamic, and resilient society for the current and our future generations. Today, we are glad to have three excellent speakers sharing with us their views on these issues. So first of all, I would like to introduce Ms. Yvonne Lucas. So Yvonne Lucas is currently the Executive Director of New Zealand Committee of the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council. Prior to this position, Yvonne served at the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade for decades and was deeply involved in the bilateral and multilateral trade negotiations. So it's my pleasure to invite Yvonne to share with us her insights on New Zealand digital economy and the opportunities for digital trade. Yvonne, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, hi, Ping. Just to make a correction, I mean, I did spend a lot of time in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs where I essentially dealt with economic issues, CER and international trade issues. But then I moved to the Ministry of Economic Development, which actually shifted my focus to the domestic economy and its interlinkages actually with the external economy. And that really brought me to the point of understanding how it's not possible to talk about one without talking about the other. So I'm here essentially to talk very briefly about PEC's signature project this past year, which New Zealand led, recognizing that New Zealand was the host of APEC and that we had the opportunity at this juncture to help shape some thinking in the area of the digital space. Now, what's, of course, the starting point for all of this is that we all recognized initially that we're going through a transformational period, which we haven't seen before. Perhaps you'd have to go right back to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution to see this kind of big change. And so there are now huge, the rate of change is being obviously supported by digitalization, and it's being embraced by governments and by business, and as we both see the huge potential for adding value, the creation of new products, and really for increasing productivity. But this digitalization has actually raised a huge array of complex and internet-connected policy issues, and indeed at the business level. And this stands in marked contrast to where we started with the international trade issues in the GATT and then moving on to the WTO. We have now before us things that we've never had to really pay a lot of attention to before when we were talking about hard trade in goods and services. So now these new issues, this is what the primer is actually designed to elicit, they do pose very new risks, very new costs. They underpin a lot of the tensions that we're starting to see in the system at the moment. And of course, they do provide huge opportunities, which we need in a sense collectively and in a coordinated way to address. Now, the primer, which I do recommend, I haven't got any time here really to go through all the issues. So this is a light touch to provide you a helicopter view of the issues that we need to address. Heads up, right from the start, the one area that is missing in it is the advent and the implications of digital currency and cryptocurrency. This is something that we may seek to actually address as we go forward. I also want to make a to say that I am not the expert in any of this. I managed a process through which we engaged Access Partnership, Dr. Peter Lovelock and Grace Gowan, to help us construct the primer and to think about the framework, the easiest framework in which to actually dig in to the issues. So, and we hope that this primer will actually help support really informed discussion in APEC, okay? Now, it does, the other thing I want to make clear, it doesn't actually offer any policy prescriptions or argue in favor of one thing or the other. The whole purpose is to elicit the issues and start to think, to provide a basis on which people can see what the key issues are, how they're interconnected, and how therefore they may take their understanding of issues, whether it is in goods, services, new services, etc. So that's my opening remarks, and I realize they probably only have about 8 minutes left to actually continue. So what did we do? We actually set up a framework. Just even getting the framework to actually split out the issues was really important. And there are many ways that you could cut this, but a key concept for us was to actually try and separate out, while recognizing the total interconnectedness of the digital economy issues, which are, it's not just domestic, but global, from the digital trade issues, which in some respects, I always think are a bit of a subset, but provide a feedback loop into policy considerations vis-a-vis the digital economy. Now, in the digital economy, so we split out the digital economy from the trade economy for the purposes of writing and discussion. And then we identified a bunch of cross-cutting issues, which are to the fore in most domestic agendas, and indeed internationally, which include digital development strategies, what's required there, digital driving, how digital can drive inclusivity, how digital can support, if handled correctly, closing the digital divide, but there's forces pulling in the other direction as well. Digitalization, supporting the green economy and the general environmental issues associated with sustainability. And finally, how digital provides the opportunity for both big business and small business. Now, if I could just briefly touch on the sorts of issues that we talk about, address in the primer on the digital economy. We've identified 5 or 6 broad headings, one of which is obviously data protection, privacy. This is being debated, discussed. Initiatives are being put forward, but not necessarily in a coordinated international way, on data protection and privacy. These have this issue has huge strategic implications as well. And the question we try to ask us is, how can we find a balance between ensuring strong protections while creating an enabling environment for data use? Cybersecurity probably doesn't need much discussion. It's huge, and it's on everybody's plate at the moment. And the issues associated with it and the risks associated with it are only going to grow. So the need for some sort of coordinated approach in this area is probably quite strong. Then the issue which probably most trade policy officials do not necessarily look at directly is the implications for competition policy in the digital economy. Now, things have changed, and the balance of power, balance of what supports innovation versus what supports consumers, all these things need to actually be looked at again. And economies, and you see it now, are really starting to think how their competition laws and regulations from the pre-digital age may need now to be revisited in light of the implications of the digital environment. And the other area is, well, obviously online consumer protection. And this is very much related to data and privacy issues, because now consumers, in some respects, I have no idea who's got my data, who's actually sending me stuff through the system, and how these algorithms are all working. So there's a whole raft of issues associated with that. And lastly, in the context of these foundational issues for the digital economy, there probably needs to be a new look at how we approach intellectual property. Things are definitely changing. I mean, I consume an enormous amount of intellectual property for which I don't pay, as far as I can see. Is there the models for capturing the value have actually changed. So there are a lot of issues in the digital economy, and I go back to that because these are all related, have implications for trade, digital trade. There are questions associated of the confidence we have in digital identities. That's very, very important as you talk about cross-border activity, and the mechanisms and trust that we can build in the context of processes for data sharing, which is huge. Then moving on from that, in the context of the foundational issues for looking at the digital economy, again, have a huge bearing on the digital trade side, are really coming to understand the implications of the disruptors in the system, which, you know, include things like artificial intelligence, where it's at today, its potential capability for the future, how this actually supports business innovation, productivity, but also in this area, the question of downside risks that will have to be managed. And these are issues not only for business, but clearly there are issues for the government, governments around the region as well. And we're very familiar, as it's played out in the press almost daily, about this question of intermediate liability on these big platforms now. Who is responsible for the quality, the truthfulness, etc., and the way these platforms have developed themselves into innovators of new services, and how they're actually distributed? How do we know what's going on there? And do we need to take these things into account as we think about the trade policy agenda? And the last one in the foundational issues is clearly in the disruptors section is questions of content moderation. I read the Australian press, and these last two things, intermediate liability and content moderation, are things that are really exercising the Australian public policy machinery. So when we look at the specific issues in this thing on digital trade, and again, I've always seen this, even when I was working in trade policy pre-digital, that trade is actually a subset of the overall frameworks that actually define one's economy and the interactions between one's economy and another. And so for trade, the core issues then become data flows, how cross-border data flows, how these are handled, what regulations that we might want to put in place in view of how we ascertain particular risks in this. We do know that cross-border data flows are enormously important for driving the innovation. We also know that there's also discussion around, well, how do we capture the value of the data that we've been creating to ourselves to actually take a more competitive position.
Yvonne?
Yep.
Yvonne, I think we can probably stop here, and we will continue with the second.
Okay. All right. Well.
So maybe you can wrap up with 1 or 2 sentences.
Yeah, well, I will. The things that I would just simply say at this stage is that all these issues that are highly interconnected and how we respond to them can actually deliver or reinforce the regulatory fragmentation that is actually currently taking place as jurisdictions themselves try to figure out how they can deliver what they think is the right outcome. And in the end, we end up potentially with a new world, but where the same old story about regulatory arbitration actually takes place. People actually, because we haven't actually decided what the commonality of our policy responses will be, people rearrange their economic activities along the line of maximizing the regulatory arbitrage opportunities. Okay, I'll stop there and let others go, but
right.
With just a helicopter view, I'm sorry that it's almost an impossible task.
All right, thank you very much for your excellent overview about.
Steph will give the much more detail than me.
Yeah. So thank you for your excellent overview about the opportunity and challenge for the digital economy. Now let's invite our second speaker, Graham Muller. He is the Chief Executive Officer of New Zealand Technology Industry Association, New Zealand Tech. Graham has a broad background in technology and business research, management consulting, and marketing across multiple sectors. He also has international experience in leading teams and building business in New Zealand, Australia, and many other countries. So it's my pleasure to invite Graham to share with us his recent work on digital economy. Graham, the floor is yours.
Kia ora, Haiping. Tēnā koutou katoa. It's lovely to be here. I thought I might start quickly by introducing NZ Tech, just so you've got a concept of that. So NZ Tech is a not-for-profit association of associations, let's say. There are now 22 associations in our Tech Alliance, collectively, and it's funded by members. It's not a government funded, it's an NGO. Over 1,600 organizations, and their employees now account for more than 10% of the workforce. So we've got this big collective of people and companies and communities that really care about what our purpose is creating a more prosperous New Zealand underpinned by technology. And NZ Tech's member base is a kind of a reflection of what technology means for New Zealand. So it's not just the IT firms you'd expect and the SaaS companies and the gaming companies, but it's also all the banks. There's now 28 government agencies are members, the universities, and organizations like Air New Zealand and Fonterra and the like. So there's a lot of organizations that really care about the impact of tech and how that'll play into their future and New Zealand's future. Underpinning this is the tech sector in New Zealand. That's like the heart of our work. And the nice thing about the tech sector is that it is growing, and it is growing at a rapid pace, which is great for New Zealand. So I thought I shared a few stats and data points with everyone, so get a bit of a sense of what the digital trade opportunity is and how we're actually progressing in lieu of policy, I guess, to some degree. So the tech sector's actually now got over 23,000 firms in it in New Zealand, over 111,000 employees, which is more than 5% of New Zealand's employees or workforce now working in the tech sector. In 2020, it created $8.6 billion worth of exports, which by halfway through 2021 had risen it to the second largest export sector in New Zealand. Obviously, COVID has had an impact on tourism, but it's good to see that the tech sector has been growing to fill that gap. And it's this growth that's really the most amazing part of what's happening in this digital space. Tech sector exports have been growing at a CAGR of 10 over the last 5 years at a rate of over 10.8% per annum. Not many parts of the economy could say that they're growing at 10.8%. And if you take the 200 largest tech exporters, they are now selling over $11 billion worth of New Zealand tech internationally, and have been growing at a rate of 14.4%. So the big firms are growing even faster than the average. And another, I guess, data point, which is quite interesting, is that this growth and this New Zealand tech out in the global market is attracting investors. And growth and investment is a great sign that we've got a vibrant, strong sector. Just to give you a sense what that's like, in 2020, $160 million worth of capital was invested into early stage companies. So into companies that were really new and that were just starting to grow, and that's up 48% on the previous year. And at the VC private equity end, $2.4 billion was invested into New Zealand tech firms from VCs, and that was growing at 110% per annum. So it's a stunning amount of growth. If we break it down, so that tech sector includes biotech, high-tech manufacturing, and digital. If I break it just down to the digital space, and if I break it down even further, the big opportunity for New Zealand is software as a service. So this is the creation of intellectual property, which is made here in New Zealand by New Zealanders, employing New Zealanders, sold over the internet and on a license fee basis, and you get an annuity and the money flowing back into New Zealand. So the software as a service sector is growing at 16% per annum for the last 5 years. And it's give you a sense of the scale of that organization, that part of the economy, and why that's important. It's creating a massive amount of jobs, so around about 5,000 new jobs a year in New Zealand. Those jobs are going at an average salary of $100,000 a year. So creating this growth of digital trade is creating high value jobs in New Zealand. And that's twice the average salary in these companies is twice the medium wage for New Zealanders. They're also highly productive firms. So to pick a couple of examples, Pushpay, the average revenue per employee in that company, and they've got hundreds of employees, the average revenue is $620,000 per employee. Xero is $233,000 per employee. So most of these digital firms are creating highly productive firms, which are creating, which is a big opportunity to address for New Zealand. And lastly, of course, is emissions. Digital trade, by and large, is low emission. So whilst we do have to concern ourselves about some of the more uses of digital and some of the tools and the full life cycle of some of the devices we might need, from a digital trade perspective, exporting SaaS products is low emissions, and it's actually helps out on the climate change side of things. So I guess my job was to create a sense of what it actually looks like from a sector perspective and what the opportunity could be, and why it's important for New Zealand. And I'm keen, after we've heard from Steph, to actually jump in a conversation with Yvonne and Steph about some of those policy things. So it's great to see the sector growing as it is, but I think with some of those settings right, we can actually get way more growth than we've currently got even. Thanks, Haiping. You're on mute, Haiping.
Thank you, Graham, for sharing with us the current development in New Zealand tech and digital trade. Is quite promising that New Zealand companies doing very well in this dimension. Our third speaker is Stephanie Honey. So Stephanie is currently Deputy Executive Director of New Zealand APEC Business Advisory Council. Prior to taking this position, she has worked on a range of roles in the MFED over the course of 17 years, primarily focusing on trade policy issues. And Stephanie has served for a period as New Zealand Chief Agricultural Negotiator in the WTO Doha round, and as well as holding positions in Brussels and with extensive engagement on trade matters in Americas, Europe, Asia, and Australia. Stephanie has been recently involved with this year's APEC process. It's my pleasure to invite Stephanie to share with us her recent research on digital economy. Stephanie, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks very much, Haiping, and for that kind introduction. Tēnā koutou katoa, everybody. May I just clarify that I'm speaking today in my personal capacity from Honey Consulting rather than with any of my other affiliations. And I guess my main message today is that digital is the new black in trade policy. If you're interested in trade or work on trade, digital is where it's at. And digital trade is big and it's growing really rapidly. For some years now, it's been worth far more than trade in physical goods. It drives trade in services. And here's a crazy number for you. By next year, the volume of data flows, which are, if you like, the kind of the lifeblood of digital trade, the proxy for digital trade and digitally enabled trade, that volume of data flows next year will be bigger than all the data flows that have gone before up to 2016. And that story about the importance of digital, if it wasn't true before COVID, it certainly is now. It's really inconceivable, in fact, that we could have had the same level of relative economic and trade activity through the pandemic without digital technologies. And I'm very lucky to be speaking today following Yvonne, who talked about PEC's excellent primer, which I'd really warmly recommend to everybody, which makes a very clear case for why we need digital trade, but also importantly, why we need it to be interoperable, the importance of agreeing definitions, what exactly is this beast, and how to measure it. I'm also very lucky to be following Graham, who, as always, gave a very compelling case for the sort of brilliant success story of the New Zealand tech sector. But of course, digital goes far beyond tech. In fact, we do need to create the right enabling environment globally for tech, but also for trade in every sector, whether we're talking about exports of dairy or machinery, a woman entrepreneur selling on an e-commerce platform, an iwi video game developer. All New Zealanders benefit, or all New Zealand businesses benefit from what digital offers: scale, scope, speed, lower costs, greater reach, higher integrity, the opportunities for value adding. And this really matters for New Zealand. And it matters not just because of all those benefits, but because we're facing a very contested and disrupted future. I was hoping to be able to allude now to some of the earlier speakers today, but I think we all know that the picture out there is pretty chaotic. But also the world is increasingly digitalized. So digital's really gone from a sort of a nice to have to a must have. And why it matters for us in New Zealand, down at the bottom of the South Pacific here, is because most of those big data flows I talked about really take place involving or within our Asia Pacific neighbourhood. So what happens here really matters too. And we have an absolutely incredible opportunity to help shape the trade architecture in that regard. So I'd like to talk about how we design trade rules for this brave new world. In a nutshell, we need transparent, predictable, consistent and interoperable trade rules across the widest possible market. For those of you who already do trade policy, that's a pretty familiar set of ideas. But good trade policy in the digital world also needs lots of other things. It needs to protect privacy and cybersecurity and other legitimate concerns, but not at the same time adding disproportionate costs and barriers. It needs to, of course, balance the government's right to regulate in the public interest, and especially in relation to Te Ao Māori and perform its role as the treaty partner. But it also needs to guard against protectionism and enhance the ability of all companies, large and small, to operate successfully in the digital world. Markets don't just need to be open, but they also need to be fair. And something that's really unique to the digital world, good digital trade policy also needs to be responsive, because this is not a static picture. Digital technology and digital business models aren't standing still, and nor should the trade rules. And in fact, one of the valid critiques of the WTO is that it actually hasn't come up with new rules for this digital world. In fact, most of the current rules were written at a time when a fax machine was about as fancy as it got. And I'm sure lots of you younger folks in the audience today have probably never even seen a fax machine. So really the world's moved on. And this is a really interesting time for digital trade governance. Unfortunately, our starting point is a very fragmented landscape. So we're seeing lots and lots of new digital trade barriers, paradoxically, even as we're seeing those data flows increase, and a sort of parallel exponential growth in digital regulation. What do digital trade barriers look like? Well, they don't look a lot like traditional trade barriers. They can look like things like rules for storing data or requirements to present a physical piece of paper. But of course, digital trade doesn't really look like trade either. You don't often see 40-foot containers of Netflix or Google search going across borders. But don't worry, for those of you who might be feeling anxious about how to navigate in this new digital landscape, protectionism still unfortunately lives and breathes. Now, we're also seeing a huge increase in the number of trade agreements that include digital provisions, but again, in a very fragmented way. So around half the FTAs that have been concluded since 2000 include at least some digital provisions, including one of the first, if not the first, was the New Zealand-Singapore CEP back in 2000. And 2/3 of WTO members are party to an FTA with e-commerce related provisions. And this includes some pretty big agreements. So the two big Asia Pacific mega regionals, CPTPP and RCEP, as well as USMCA, some of the big EU bilaterals, including with Canada and Japan. So we're talking about rules that cover large swathes of global GDP. But unfortunately for exporters, most of these agreements are very different in terms of scale, scope, ambition, and really the underpinning philosophy about how to regulate and what the rights and roles of individuals, companies, and the government are. You might have heard that sort of famous trade metaphor about how divergent rules can create a spaghetti bowl for exporters. And really what we're facing now is a digital spaghetti bowl. Now, for those of you, as I, was a former WTO negotiator, of course, the first best solution is the WTO. And trade using the World Wide Web is fundamentally global and borderless, so it just makes sense to think about WTO rules. And there has been a very intensive process of sort of willing parties. About 86 WTO members, including New Zealand, have been working in Geneva to try to negotiate new rules for e-commerce. They call it, not digital, but it's the same thing. And those talks have made very good progress. In fact, in a handful of areas, there's legal text pretty much finalised, but we're a long way from comprehensive outcomes, including on the most sort of high friction points like data flows. So let me turn instead to a disruptive new model. Disruption's, kind of the key theme for digital. So there's disruption in trade rules too, thanks to New Zealand, Singapore and Chile, the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, or DEPA. And the DEPA really ticks all those boxes I talked about earlier for what constitutes good digital trade policy. So the first thing is it takes a holistic view of trade in the digital economy. This is not just a handful of provisions, as we see in CPTPP, on data flows, non-discrimination and digital trade facilitation. It goes much further. It essentially tries to enable end-to-end transactions and business models. So it's got detail on things like e-payments, e-invoicing. It tries to enhance trust. So it's got principles for privacy, online dispute resolution, online safety. It's responsive, so it's got frameworks for emerging technologies like AI or digital identities or fintech, data innovation, and it also has a very heavy emphasis on inclusion in SMEs, as well as trying really throughout to leverage these ideas about interoperability, regulatory coherence and standards. Another salient feature, it's deliberately conceived as a living agreement, so countries can add in new issues. And really importantly, it bakes in a process of collaboration, especially in those sort of emerging technology areas. So for example, Yvonne mentioned AI. We just don't really understand enough yet, no matter how smart we are at trade policy or legal rules or economics, we just don't understand how AI intersects with and will impact on trade, inclusion, the economic implications, but clearly we're at risk from unintended consequences, perhaps quite serious unintended consequences, if we don't have good guardrails. And now AI may not quite be right for sort of formal trade rules, but it's definitely ready for a conversation. And that's what DEPA offers in that area and many others. And a really important part of that is integrating business stakeholders and civil society into the process. So we need to kind of co-design these rules together. And it's of course businesses in particular who are at the front lines of understanding how technology and business models actually work. The other really important part, and I guess to come to sort of my main message about DEPA, is it's deliberately conceived as a building block. It is drawing on an approach that's been used very successfully in APEC. It's no accident that the three members are APEC economies. And so it can serve as both an incubator of ideas, which APEC does, but also a way to build up from soft norms into hard law in sort of ever agglomerating circles. And we've seen this model used very successfully for other agreements that were born in the APEC cradle, if you like, so ANZFTA or CPTPP or RCEP. Another really important feature is that it's led by small economies. So it's often said very fairly that the digital world is really tripolar, with the EU, US and China making up those poles. That's true for sure. But small countries can also come up with good ideas, especially since, I think it's fair to say we may not see the digital world as in quite the same way as some of those big players. It's not a zero-sum game with winners and losers. We can all benefit from a collaborative approach. And so, like a tiny snowball building momentum, the idea is that others will come aboard deeper as a whole, or will take some of the modules and integrate them into their own agreements, leading to greater regional coherence. This idea of concerted open plurilateralism. And we're already seeing that working. So Korea is formally acceding, China has signaled its interest in joining, and Canada has also shown serious interest. But DEPA isn't the only game in town. We're also seeing Singapore negotiate a range of other very similar agreements with Australia, Vietnam, Korea, the UK, and underpinning those with some really deep, detailed work programs on regulatory coherence or mutual recognition. And in some ways, these go further than DEPA, but they're really kind of a closed cell. So what two countries might be able to do together isn't necessarily a good basis for a framework that you're hoping others will dock into. We're also hearing from the US that they want to do a digital agreement in the Indo-Pacific. And of course, there are some very complex geopolitics around this, as between China and the US. Those are two absolute giants in the digital economy. They're both outstanding at harnessing the power of data. In the recent UNCTAD Digital Economy report, they assessed that those two economies together account for half the world's hyperscale data centers, and it's all about data. They have the highest rate of 5G adoption. 94% of all the funding of AI startups happens in those two countries, and more than 90% of the market capitalization of platforms. But they're both bringing a real narrative around national security to these issues. So we're seeing, you know, sort of the friction points around physical infrastructure, cybersecurity, industrial policy, competition policy, and control of data. And, you know, I think for their own reasons, both are perhaps reluctant to embrace everything that's in DEPA right now. Some recent Chinese regulations, it's hard to see how they fit with the DEPA rules on trade flows. The US has got a very strong theme around a worker-centric trade policy, whatever that means, although I think you can actually make a case that DEPA fits pretty well with that. But these are the two giants, so it's really important that they collaborate together. And of course, we've also got the EU actively world building in this space, creating its own digital norms, its own single digital market, exporting its regulatory model with GDPR, and now more recently agreeing to collaborate in global standards setting with the US as a sort of counterweight to China. So
Stephanie, would you like to wrap up quickly in 1 minute?
I'm in my last sentence.
Thank you.
Hoping, sorry. In effect, what I'm going to say as my conclusion is this doesn't make sense. We're creating a new digital noodle bowl, certainly one that's high standard, responsive, innovative, but it's still a spaghetti bowl all the same. And we'd be far better to use something like DEPA to build out the details, including really resourcing and putting effort and strategy into that, and actively bringing others on board. I mean, we're really at the crossroads now. We could choose the fragmentation path or the integration path, but I think for me, the case is really clear. Integration is the way to go. And with that, apologies for going on too long. I just find this all so interesting. Thanks very much, Haiping and my fellow panelists.
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie, for a very broad introduction about the digital economy, digital trade, and all these challenges related to the new generation of trade. And we have quite a couple of questions from the floor. So I would like to first raise a question from Glenn Candy. So Glenn asked a question to Stephanie. What do you see as the regional opportunities and challenges for agreements like DEPA and the scope for new plurilateral agreements in the next 5 years? So I think you have mentioned quite a few about that already, yes, but would you like to?
Nothing really to add. I mean, I think that is, you know, really allows us to fulfill the promise of the digital economy. So I'd love to see building out of DEPA as a very deliberate New Zealand strategy and global and regional strategy in the years to come. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you there is another question to Graham. So which is the largest export market for software as service companies? This is a question from Camille Ayras.
Hi, thanks for the question. Yeah, so New Zealand's main digital exports are into the US. It's the largest market. Followed closely by the UK, Australia, and Singapore. We do have spread though, because it's a digital export offering to most countries in the world. So whilst the most exporting is currently done where the main populations are, because most of the products are still built in English, and so that it has to date limited the reach up into Asia.
Okay, thank you. So we also have a question about from Melissa Quarry. So Melissa asked a question to Stephanie: where do you see the Middle East and Africa fitting into the emerging area of trade?
Thanks, Melissa. That's a great question. Unfortunately, one of the other areas of fragmentation that we're seeing is around this idea of a digital divide. So where the developed world on average has about 85% internet penetration, developing economies is much lower, sort of hovering around 30 to 50%. And unfortunately, LDCs, which are, of course, there are many in that part of the world that you mentioned, especially in Africa, only around 20%. So that's a real problem. We actually need to actively seek to build capacity and build out the infrastructure to enable all of those countries to participate. Otherwise, it's not just a question of not having the benefits, they will really risk being left further and further behind as the world digitalizes. But one thing I would just say is that Africa, in fact, in the new African Continental Free Trade Agreement, includes quite a lot of quite forward-looking digital provisions. And, I think that's a really exciting potential. Essentially, some of the participants in those economies are going to be able to kind of leapfrog some of the old rigidities that we in the Western world, for example, have around digital financial services, for example, and can use digital technologies there. So huge potential for that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie. So we have another question about the PCC's recent effort in the primer of digital economy. So may I ask Yvonne to share with us your thoughts about the major challenge or most important challenge that New Zealand firms consider as engaging in digital trade overseas. So given this primer, the document, very important documents you have prepared, so we probably can share with us a few major challenges for New Zealand companies.
Well, I'm probably not the best person to actually answer that, because the issue around the primer, what the primer was designed to do was to highlight all the areas, all the issues now, which are both posing opportunities but considerable risks to be managed for policy machinery, for the policy machineries, but also for business to contemplate in terms of what the right outcomes or the least costly outcomes might be for them. In other words, an enabling environment. So can I pick anything? I can't pick a specific issue in that context, but I think that where I left off, and certainly where Stephanie left off, is that one of the biggest challenges now is that we could the regulatory fragmentation that now is potentially going to take place is actually going to have a high cost associated, high compliance costs associated with it, if we do not actually start to understand how we can better apply. Some of them are old frameworks in terms of the use of standards to help coordination, certification, etc., regimes to help with people's building trust. These issues, though, don't have to be only addressed by government. They can be addressed by business themselves. Businesses themselves, I've identified probably 80% of the standards in the ISO, within the ISO framework alone, which has actually which they've bought into and which they've applied good certification regimes around to actually build trust. So I feel the question, I'm not really equipped to actually come to a very specific answer on that, Haiping. And in some respects I think it's really important for business to stay on top of where inter-country dialogue is going on these issues, to see whether we're actually providing the type of thinking that will actually enable the digital economy to really flourish with innovation and productivity increases, And what out there might in fact provide a serious stumbling block to it. We're aware ourselves already on all the issues around 5G and the big platforms. We're also aware of the issues associated with extraordinary power that some of the big platforms have, which prevent necessarily the ability of smaller players to actually extract value from the system before they're sort of blown away. Again, I'm sorry, I apologize. I do come at it from very much a policy perspective. And in some respects, that's what the primer does. It's help both policy officials and businesses to think these issues through and hopefully support some useful and coordinated dialogue on them in order to proceed with what Stephanie was talking about, to actually reflect these understandings in the actual bilateral or plurilateral agreements that will take place. I guess from my perspective, Steph, I mean, if I may, just to you, I'm probably not quite as sanguine about the WTO at the moment. And I would suggest in this context, and having just come off our APEC year, I think that APEC itself could play a huge role in actually supporting in-depth discussion and coordination around these issues, and therefore by that means help what might actually pin the eventual approaches that the WTO and the bilateral plurilateral agreements will take. But I might be too optimistic there, I don't know.
Thank you. Thank you for the reply. So we have another question from Craig Hatto. Sure.
Do you mind if I just pick up a point that Yvonne made?
Definitely.
One of the things in the digital environment, which I think New Zealand can do in parallel to policy work, is really lean into standards.
Yes, absolutely.
So there's a lot of fragmentation on, to use an example, we're leaning into the standards around agri-data at the moment. Because everyone calls a tractor something different and a farm something different and a gate something different. It's lowly and it's boring, but as soon as you get those sort of agreements as a foundation, I think it makes it a lot easier for policy to be built on top of.
Yeah, look, I couldn't agree more, Graham. I mean, when I was working in the government on these big international trade agreements as well, but from the Ministry of Economic Development perspective, standards are so critical to facilitating frictionless trade interventions, standards. And I'm not sure that we've had a big discussion in the digital context of looking at the various bodies which are creating the standards, which are developing the standards, or the standards for ensuring that the certification and accountability regimes are robust. This is all to do with trust. It's all to do with reducing compliance costs. And I think myself that people have to put on a new thinking hat in that context. The mutual recognition agreements associated with standards in order to make trade flow have always had a very mirror-like effect. I'll do if you do. So the obligations are completely symmetric. And one thing that we did do in our discussions with China on the regulatory side is we broke that mold and we actually looked at how can we do facilitation, build confidence, build trust, using different models, which are not necessarily full mutual recognition models, or at least the balance of mutual recognition value is found in different components of the agreement. So we have one component where we would.
Yvonne, I think we will move on to the next question.
Yeah, sure,
Thank you for the question. Thank you for the reply.
Yeah.
So we have another question from Craig Hatto. What does the panel think about the settings needed to ensure we have the people in New Zealand who can be part of the growing digital sectors? So may I invite one of our speakers to start with?
If I may, part of the having digital trade requires digital people, and there is a global shortage of digital people. And so to enable digital trade in the world, we need free flow of movement of digital people, basically. So certainly New Zealand, like every other economy in the world, major economy, is short of digital skills. We need to top some of our digital skills up with some of the best in the world. So we need policy that's enables that. But then we also sometimes need to move those digital people into the markets where we're trading with. So you need the easy flow of these professionals.
Yeah, thank you very much for
add to that very quickly, Haiping. I know we're short on time, but
yeah.
just to say that's absolutely, I fully agree with Graham. It's a really important need there. But as well as that, we need to be thinking more holistically about the whole economy. So we certainly need all the software engineers and everything else, but we also need to equip our small businesses who might be in dairy products, for example, to operate successfully in the digital world as well. And I think the government's done some great work with its Digital Boost program to try to facilitate that, but that's a really important component of success in the digital economy as well.
Okay,
so
thank you very much for all the
discussion. Be built into the education system, that digital citizenship and skills come up through the system.
Yeah, I'm sure that this discussion will go on and on with so many topics to cover. So in the end, we would like to thank everyone for attending today's session. It's very encouraging views about digital economy. And we will look forward to your attendance for tomorrow's session. Before we move on to the next part, I would like to invite Jennifer to make some remarks. Jennifer, the floor is yours.
Kia ora, thank you, Haiping, and thank you to our panelists for a really insightful session, especially on a day when we've had some digital challenges of our own. So I just have some housekeeping points in advance of tomorrow. So I want to remind everybody that we're back on again tomorrow at 9 a.m. So please just follow your original links that you have to that, and we will be opening at 9 o'clock, and we start off with a speech from Rino Tirakatne, the Parliamentary Undersecretary for Trade and Export Growth, and that is followed by a really important panel on UNDRIPS to Tiriti and inclusive trade. So I look forward to seeing you all again then. For now, I would also like to remind you that all these panel sessions, including the one we had to go off into a back room and record ourselves separately on geopolitics, are now all available on your platform. You just go to your timeline and you push view and then push play. So if you've missed some sessions that you wish you'd caught, that's fine. And then if you've got any extra questions, please feel free to send them through to us at ppi@auckland.ac.nz, or use the platform in other ways to connect with people, including our speakers here today, through Meeting Hub. That way you can continue this very important conversation about digital trade, international standards, and everything else that people care about. So until then, thank you again to all our panelists today, to our event services team who've been working really hard behind the scenes to keep this going. And kia ora for now, and see you tomorrow. Ka kite.